Hello and welcome to our next lesson in this topic on adaptation and competition. So today we're going to be looking at something called variation. By the end of the lesson you should be able to tell me what variation is, you should be able to describe how variation in species occurs, and you should be able to explain the difference between environmental and inherited variation. So in your books, as you would do normally, I would like you to write the title please, variation. I would like you to put the date, and we can make a start on the lesson notes. So we're going to start today with a key word. The word is variation. Variation. Now, variation can be defined as the differences in characteristics between organisms of the same species. So, differences in characteristics of between organisms of the same species. Now, before we move on any further, I want us to define species, because that is a very important word and it has a very specific definition in biology. Okay, so our next keyword is the word species. Now, a species is defined as a group of organisms, that can reproduce with each other to produce fertile offspring. To produce fertile offspring. Fertile offspring. Okay, so variation is the differences in characteristics between organisms of the same species, and a species is a group of organisms that can reproduce with each other to produce fertile offspring. Now, the word fertile means that you can have children. So, can have children. Okay, so if a group of organisms can reproduce with each other and produce children that can have children of their own, that is defined as a species. The differences between each of these individuals in a species is known as variation. Now, a good way of showing this is by using the image that's on the PowerPoint or the lesson presentation, is a picture of dogs. Now, dogs, believe it or not, are all the same species. They are all able to reproduce with each other, and they're all able to produce fertile offspring. So this husky here could reproduce with this dog here, this Alsatian could produce with this one could produce with this one, because they are the same species. But they look so different because there is a lot of variation between them. So we can write down, we can say that dogs are all the same species, so they can all reproduce with each other to produce fertile offspring. Fertile offspring. So because they're all the same species, any dog can reproduce with any other dog to produce fertile offspring, therefore they are the same species. But the reason they look so different is because there is a lot of variation between them. So we can put different breeds of dog look very different due to high variation. Due to high variation in the species. So variation is the differences between organisms of the same species, and a species is a group of organisms that can reproduce with each other to produce fertile offspring. By fertile we mean that they can have children. Dogs are all the same species. They can all reproduce with each other to produce fertile offspring, but the reason different breeds of dog look so different is because there is a lot of variation between the organisms. Another example that we can use, if I just refresh our screen, is humans. So we can add an image that I've pre-prepared, and again this is on the PowerPoint, so we can have this, put it over here. Now, humans have lots of variation between them. Humans are all the same species. We can all reproduce with somebody of the opposite sex to produce fertile offspring. So we can say that humans are all the same species, comma, but show variation. Full stop. Now some examples of variation are shown on the diagram. So the fact that you have a different blood group from somebody else makes you different. That gives you variation. Some are tall, some are short. That gives you variation. We speak different languages. That is an example of variation. Yeah? Some are good at some things than others. Therefore, that is a form of variation. But there are two types of variation that you need to know about. Okay? So, environmental variation and genetic variation are two different things. So we can say there are two types of variation. The first type of variation we'll talk about is genetic variation. Genetic variation. Now, genetic variation is sometimes known as inherited variation, is variation that is caused by the characteristics we get from our parents. So genetic variation, we can say, is variation caused by the DNA / genes We inherit from our parents. Okay, so I am going to add underneath here, I'm just going to put it in red because it is fairly important, that genetic variation is also known as inherited variation. And some examples of genetic variation can include skin colour, eye colour, so e.g. skin colour, eye colour, we can say blood type. These are all examples of inherited or genetic variation. The second type of variation is what's known as environmental variation. Environmental variation. So number 2, we can say environmental variation. Environmental variation. Environmental variation is variation caused from your surroundings and what happens to you during your lifetime. So we can say variation caused by the environment and what happens during the lifetime. During lifetime. Now, some examples of environmental variation can include tattoos, scars, dyed hair. These are all things that are caused by your environment. We could even go as far as to say the language you speak, because the only reason you speak English is because you were raised in England. If you were raised in Spain, you would have grown up speaking Spanish. So examples of environmental variation, e.g. we can say scars, tattoos, we can say, if I can spell tattoos right, we can say language. These are all examples of environmental variation. Now, sometimes variation can be a mixture of the two. So we can say, and I'll see if I can fit it down here, sometimes variation is caused by both genes and environment. Okay, so sometimes it can be caused by both. Now, because I've run out of room, I'm going to write it at the top here. We can say an example of this. So I'm going to go for this greeny colour. We can say, e.g., height. While you might have the genes to be tall, you might not have the food available in your environment to allow you to grow. So we can put e.g. height, and we can say you might have the genes. You might have genes, but no food. So you may live in a country where there's very few nutrients available. Therefore, even if you do have the gene, you're not going to grow as tall. Okay? So there's two types of variation. This is shown in humans because we're the same species. We just show variation. There's genetic variation, which is caused by our DNA, our genes that we inherit from our parents. We cannot change our genetic variation. And our environmental variation, which is variation caused by the environment and what happens to us during our lifetime. These are things like scars, tattoos, language spoken. Sometimes variation is caused by both genes and the environment. An example of that would be height. You might have the genes to be tall, but you might not have any food to grow. Okay? Our final part for this lesson, we need to talk about what causes variation. We have already touched upon this, but we'll just go over it very briefly. So we can say that variation is caused by multiple things. It can be caused by both your genes and your environment. In fact, I'm not going to go over that because we have just said it. So if we have a look back at our learning objectives, you should be able to tell me what variation is. You should be able to tell me the difference between environmental and inherited variation, and you should be able to tell me how it occurs. So variation occurs by having different genes from different parents, and it also can be caused by things that have happened to you in your lifetime. I've got cauliflower ears. I was born with normal ears, so I have genes for normal ears, but through playing sports in my life, I've gone on to cauliflower them. So that is a form of environmental variation. That's what's happened to me in my lifetime. An example of variation, an easy one to look out for, is lobed ears. Some people have lobed ears where they have this lobe at the bottom of their ears. Some people do not have lobed ears. They have lobeless ears. This is caused by your genes. This is not, unless you cut them off, this is not environmental, but is mostly caused by your genes. So I have lobed ears. I have lobes at the bottom of my ears. Therefore, I have the genes for that. If I got a pair of scissors and cut one off now, I would have one lobed ear and one lobeless ear. The lobeless ear would be caused by environmental variation, and the lobed ear would be caused by genetic variation. So, what I would like you to do, as always, I would like you to pause the video. I would like you to have a go at the questions that are on the screen at the moment. For the first one, you need to write out the sentences, filling in the gaps. For the second, third and fourth questions, you need to copy out the question and have a go at them in your book. Could you please get a different coloured pen, preferably green, but any colour will do. And when you press play again, we will go over the answers. So pause the video now, have a go at the questions. Okay, so you should have had a go at those questions that are on the board now. We need to go over the answers so that you've got them marked in your book. Please use a different coloured pen. I would prefer you to use green, but if you haven't got a green pen, it's not the end of the world. I'm sure we'll get over it. So let's have a go at this. So the first one, if I can get a red pen, reads: the organism in a species share many of the same characteristics. They can reproduce to produce fertile offspring. Differences in characteristics within a species are known as variation. Variation can be a result of environmental factors, or through genetic or inherited factors. you could have had those last two either way round. So the organisms in a species share many of the same characteristics. They can reproduce to produce fertile offspring. Differences in characteristics within a species is known as variation. Variation can be a result of environmental factors or through inherited factors. You could have had inherited and environmental the other way round. So what I'm going to do, because we haven't got much room, or shall we try and, we'll try and do it without removing that so that you can mark it. So let's add our second question. So how am I going to do this? In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that bigger. I'm just going to add them in and then we'll refresh the screen. So for question 2, it says, copy and complete the table using the words below. So you needed to put these qualities into either environmental, inherited, or both. So inherited, we could have had blood group, and we could have also had eye colour. Under environmental, we could have had, so we've got eye colour and we've got blood group gone. Under environmental, we could have had tattoo or scars. And then finally, under both, we could have body mass, because you could have the genes to have a high body mass, but no food available to having a big body mass. And you could have also said intelligence, because although you've got the genes to be intelligent, you may not have any education or any way of learning, so it won't improve. So you should have had environmental variation, tattoos and scars. Under inherited variation, you should have had blood group and eye colour. And under both, you should have had body mass and intelligence. I do need to clear the screen now, so I strongly suggest, if you haven't already marked this, pause the video and get it finished. But for now, we need to move on. So if we clear the screen, go back to black, pull up our question, question 2. We can put these up here in the corner. So for question 3, it was asking, explain why identical twins are the best people to study if you want to find out how the environment influences characteristics. So for number 2, let's get our red pen back. You needed to say, for 1 mark, that identical twins have the same inherited characteristics. Have the same genes or inherited characteristics. Okay? For your second mark, you needed to say that therefore any differences are caused by the environment. So therefore any differences are caused by the environment. So for the first mark, you needed to say that identical twins, this isn't question 2, this is question 3, identical twins have the same genes. And for a second mark, you needed to say, therefore, any differences are caused by their environment. Question 4, our final question, says, explain in detail the difference between inherited and environmental variation. So for 1 mark, you needed to say, that variation is the differences between organisms in a species. So by defining what variation is, you got a mark. So by saying that variation is the differences between organisms in a species, you get a mark. You then needed to say that inherited variation comes from your parents. So inherited variation comes from the parents. If you then gave some examples of inherited variation, you get a third mark. So you could have put e.g. lobed ears, eye colour, blood group, that's for your third mark. You needed to give examples of inherited variation. Environmental variation for a fourth mark. Environmental variation is caused by the environment an organism is found in. The environment an organism is found in. Okay. Now again, for your fifth mark, you need to give some examples. You could have said scars. So, e.g. scars, tattoos. You could have said language. You could have said dyed hair. Remember, if you're dyeing your hair, that is an example of environmental variation. For your sixth mark, you needed to say some characteristics are due to a combination of genetics and environment. And you could have given an example, e.g. of height or body mass would be another good one. Okay, so for question 4, explain in detail the differences between inherited and environmental variation. You need to say that variation is the differences between organisms in a species. You needed to say that inherited variation comes from parents, such as, for a third mark, lobed ears, eye colour, blood group. For a fourth mark, environmental variation is caused by the environment an organism is found in. For a fifth mark, for example, scars, tattoos, language, dyed hair. And for a sixth mark, you needed to say that some characteristics are due to a combination of both genetics and environment. So you should now be able to tell me what variation is, you should be able to describe how variation in a species occurs, and you should be able to explain the difference between environmental and inherited variation. I hope you have found this lesson useful. If you have any questions, drop me a comment in the Google Classrooms or send me an email and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. So I will see you next lesson. All the best.